Hi, I'm Kimberly from SweetRedPoppy.com, and today I'm going to teach you how to sew. We'll cover all the basics from threading your machine to sewing a straight stitch. I know how it goes. You got a sewing machine for Christmas, you pulled it out of the box, and with all the determination in the world, you were going to learn to sew. But then you opened up your manual and started reading things like feed dog and bobbin and backstitch, and you thought, what in the world are all these words? You probably put that sewing machine right back in the closet, and it's been collecting dust ever since. Well, it's time to pull it out of the closet and dust it off, because today we're going to learn to sew. To start with, you'll want to find a small table to put your sewing machine on. Now, this is one of my most important tips. I can't tell you enough how important it is to have your sewing machine easily accessible. If it's stored away in a closet or some dark space, you're most likely going to forget about it. To get started, I've put together a list of all the sewing supplies you'll need. First off, you'll need a sewing machine. Personally, I sew in a Janome machine, and I really love this machine, but there are tons of great brands out there. The most important thing is that you invest in a high-quality machine. For beginners, I typically recommend that you spend between $200 and $300 for your first machine. You don't need a machine that has all the fancy bells and whistles to learn to sew. And you definitely don't need a machine that has a payment as high as your car payment. I know it can be tempting to get the machine with all the fancy bells and whistles. Yes, I'm talking about you, Wi-Fi enabled sewing machine, but you really don't need that. What you need is a sewing machine that will allow you to do a straight stitch and learn how to sew. Next up, you'll need sewing machine needles. Now, I purchased Schmetz needles, and they have worked wonderfully for me. I know that shopping for sewing machine needles can seem woefully overwhelming. Trust me, when I first started, I remember sitting in the aisle at Joann Fabrics, wondering what in the world all of these numbers meant. I finally had to call my mom and ask her, Mom, what in the world am I supposed to be buying? So I'm going to save you from hyperventilating in the corner of Joann's and just tell you exactly what you need. I like to go with a combination pack that will give you a variety of the needles that you'll be using while you learn to sew. But the most important one that you'll need is this 70-10 needle, and that's perfect for the fabric that we'll be sewing with. This type of sewing machine needle is designed to pierce through the fabric, while a ballpoint needle is designed to go between the knitted fibers in the fabric. And a higher number on this right here, you can see the numbers. The higher the number, it just means the heavier the fabric it works best with. So if you have a really lightweight fabric, you'll want to look for a smaller number, and if you're sewing on something heavier, look for a higher number. You'll also want to invest in some thread. Now, it can be overwhelming knowing which type of thread to buy because there are so many different colors and so many different kinds when you go to the sewing shop. My recommendation is to start with a pack of multicolored threads. These are Gutermann threads, and I buy them in a pack of 26. And that gives me a wide variety of all the colors that I might be sewing with. And then, once I've been sewing for a while, I like to buy these larger Coats and Clark spools. It has more thread on it, and once I've been sewing for a while, I have more of an idea if there's certain colors that I tend to gravitate towards. And if you get this pack with the multicolor in it, it'll save you from all those late night runs to Walmart when you find out that you don't have the right color thread, which I've done so many times. One more important sewing notion is to have pins and clips by your sewing machine at all time. I like to keep them in this handy dandy little magnetic tray. It keeps all of my pins in place, and I just set it right by my sewing machine so they're easily accessible and I can put them away as I'm sewing. Next up is a seam ripper. Now, I have a love-hate relationship with this little notion. I love that it fixes all of my mistakes, but I kind of hate using it. I love that it fixes all of my mistakes and gives me the ability to rip out seams if they aren't correct. If you're planning on doing apparel sewing, a tape measure is so important to have. This will allow you to take the measurements on your body and get an accurate number because it will fold around your body. A 5-inch pair of scissors is the perfect size to keep close for snipping threads, cutting into the seam allowance, and trimming any fabric. You'll also want a seam gauge. Now, this little tool will help you when you are ironing a project. You can turn your hem up, and then you can use this to measure it and make sure that you have the exact right seam allowance. My final suggestion is a rotary cutter, a clear ruler, and a self-healing mat. Now, cutting out fabric with a rotary cutter is a huge time saver. I am embarrassed to admit how long it took me to figure this little trick out. But now that I've been sewing for a while, I always keep this handy. This will help you to cut fabric quickly. You can just cut on this rotary mat, and the clear ruler allows you to see through what you're cutting and see exactly what your seam allowance is or how big you're cutting it. And then the self-healing mat just heals all of the cuts for you, so you're not worrying about it getting cut up. A space-saving tip for these three things is to hang a little command hook right by your sewing machine, and you can hang all three of them up on it. They all have little holes on the top, and you can just hang them so they're easily accessible but out of your way so they're not taking up your whole table. You'll also need an iron and an ironing board. I can't emphasize just how important a good iron and an ironing board are. This is a tabletop iron, but I also have a full-sized one. Ironing is absolutely an essential part of sewing. If you want a professional looking finish, you will need to get nice and comfortable with your iron. I promise it'll turn into one of your most used tools. You'll want to look for an iron that has the ability to steam and also has variable temperatures for the different types of fabric that you're working with. Next up, we'll cover fabric. We will start our lessons using 100% cotton quilting fabric. This is the ideal fabric for a beginning seamstress. It doesn't have any stretch, it's easy to cut out, and it's machine washable. Okay, we're ready to get sewing. First up, you'll want to plug your sewing machine in. This is the power cord, and it just plugs in right here. Your sewing machine might look a little bit different, but it's probably pretty similar. And then this is your foot pedal. Now, a foot pedal works by placing your foot on it and putting pressure on it. The more pressure you put on the pedal, the faster your sewing machine will sew. My sewing machine has a variable speed control, which is really helpful when you're learning to sew. I can turn it all the way down, so even if you're putting all your pressure on the foot pedal, it's not going to go very fast. If you have that ability on your machine, you'll probably want to turn it on as you learn to sew. Now you want to switch your machine on, and your light will come on. Some machines are computerized and some are not. Mine is computerized, so I have a little screen that lights up when it's turned on. To begin with, we're going to thread our machine. Make sure that you purchase the correct type of bobbin for your machine. It should come with a few bobbins, but you'll want a few backups because you'll find that you go through these bobbins pretty quickly, and each time you sew with a different color, you'll want to fill a bobbin with each color. Place the thread on the spool pin, and then place the spool holder in front of it. That will keep your thread from moving around while you're sewing. And then you will wrap the thread on the thread guide. Take your bobbin, and my bobbin has little holes on either side. I like to stick this thread through there, pinch it with my finger, and wrap it around just a few times to get it started. Then I place my thread on here, push the bobbin to the right until it clicks into place. That switches the machine from sewing to winding the bobbin. Now I'm going to put a little bit of pressure on my foot pedal to start winding the bobbin. You just want to wind it until it's full. There's a little stop right here that will keep you from going too far. And if you're planning on just doing a small amount of sewing with that color thread, you don't need to wind the bobbin all the way. Okay, now that it's wound, I'm going to cut this thread, slide this back over to the left, pull it off. I'm going to place my bobbin into my bobbin housing. Some machines are top loading and some machines are front loading. So it just depends on the type of machine you're using where your bobbin will go. You can pull out your owner's manual and check to see where it's supposed to go. So my specific bobbin goes in counterclockwise, and then there's a little lip that it catches. You just pull it until you hear it click. So now I have my thread coming out right here, and I'm going to thread my spool. If your sewing machine needle is not already in your machine, what you'll need to do is just loosen the screw down here that holds your clamp in place. You'll stick the needle in there with the flat side facing away from you. You'll want to push it up all the way as far as it can go and then tighten that screw. Okay, now we're going to thread our spool. Guide the spool of thread through the numbers. Most machines will be numbered 1 through 4, and it will just guide you easily where the thread is supposed to go. First, we go through this tension guide, and we go around here, and it goes through the take-up lever. If your take-up lever isn't showing, you can use your hand crank on the side to bring this back up. Make sure that it catches, pull it back down, go around, and then some machines have an automatic threader. Some of them you just do it by hand. I'm going to do it by hand just to show you. I go from the front of the needle towards the back, and then I pull it through. So I have my thread here, and I'm going to hold on to it, and then I'm going to hand crank to catch my bobbin thread. Okay, and then I'm just going to pull gently, and it pulls the second bobbin thread up. I'm going to put my presser foot up. Now I have both of my threads. Now I'm going to pull them away from myself and towards the back of the machine and cover my bobbin housing. Okay, let's go over a few basics of the sewing machine. On my specific sewing machine, the width controls how wide the stitch is. This is applicable when you're using a zigzag stitch or one of these other stitches that has width to it. If you're using a straight stitch, you won't need to adjust that at all. Second, I have my length. This right here controls the stitch length. Now 2.5 is the recommended stitch length for sewing a normal seam. This will give you about 12 stitches per inch. To baste the fabric, which is a temporary seam and will be pulled out at a later moment, you will want to increase this to a 5. That gives you a stitch that holds things in place, but it can be removed if you're doing something like ruffles or just hemming something or trying something on for fit. Up here, I have my tension dial, and this just controls how tight this top thread is. It can go up or down depending on what you're sewing. Perfect tension will create a stitch where you're only able to see the thread on one side. Your bobbin thread is only visible from the back side of the fabric, and your spool thread is only viewable from the front side of the fabric. If you're seeing thread coming through on either side, then your tension needs to be adjusted. Now let's cover needle position. My needle position right now is in the normal position. Sometimes I will change that if I want to change the seam allowance, or if I'm sewing, if I'm top stitching something, then I can move it over a little bit, and that makes my seam allowance a little bit easier. But for the most part, you'll just want to keep it right where it is. Now, if you're wondering what seam allowance is, you can look right here on this throat plate. This is the metal plate, and it has lots of little markings and numbers. Those are your seam allowances. And what it's doing is it's measuring from the point of the needle to that line that it's giving you. And this is important because all sewing patterns have a seam allowance listed, and you need to pay really close attention to that. Otherwise, whatever you're sewing might not turn out. So if it says 1/2 inch, I will line up my fabric like this with the 1/2 inch, put my presser foot down and sew it. And you'll want to keep it straight the entire time. For beginners, it's really helpful to mark the correct seam allowance with a piece of washi tape or even a piece of foam tape. That will give you a little bit of a buffer so that your fabric isn't going all over the place. You want to put your presser foot down, sew for 1 inch, and then hit your backstitch button. What the backstitch button does is it just kind of locks everything in place. You'll hit that, go back to the beginning of the fabric, and then keep sewing. And everyone's backstitch button looks a little bit different, but you can look in your owner's manual to find out exactly where it's at. You want to backstitch at both the beginning and the end of every seam. Now remember, if you make a mistake, you can always use your seam ripper. I keep this close to my machine because I'm always making little mistakes. If you're feeling overwhelmed by all of these new terms, don't fret. It can be a lot to take in all at once, but once you thread your machine a few times, you'll get the hang of it. I find it's especially helpful to thread and rethread your machine over and over until you know exactly how to do it. Yes, it's a pain in the butt to do, but you'll thank me when you can practically thread your machine with your eyes closed. Okay, so maybe that's an overstatement, but you know what I mean. Now that we've covered everything on the sewing machine, we're going to sew our first stitch. I've cut a few different samples, 5 by 5 inch squares. And this is quilting cotton. Just gonna line those up and use my clips. And then I'm going to lift up my presser foot, put my presser foot down, and I'm going to use a 3/8 inch seam allowance. So that just means that my fabric is lined up with the edge of my presser foot. I'm going to press down on my pedal. I like to keep my left hand right here, kind of as my guide, and then my right hand will is used to press the back stitch button, it's used to adjust the hand wheel. It kind of can do whatever it needs to do. I'm going to sew for about 1 inch, then I'm going to press that back stitch button, go backwards, and that's just locking our stitches in place. And then I'm going to keep sewing forward. Once I get to the edge of the fabric, I'm going to stop, hit my back stitch button again, lock those stitches in place, and then sew off the fabric. Right here I have a little cutter, so I'm going to cut that string, and now I have a perfect seam. Also, one thing I wanted to tell you guys is that most of the time when you're sewing, things will be sewn right sides together. And what right sides together means is it's just referring to the right side of the pattern. So for that, if I want the pretty sides to be showing and the seam to be hidden, I need to do right sides together. So now we have our straight stitch. Now that we've covered a basic stitch and all the parts of the sewing machine, you can get going. Stay tuned for more sewing tutorial videos.